I do believe that I am good to go. Great. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you all again. And if you missed last week, you ought to go watch it on YouTube. I think we handled a pretty big topic, and I think I did okay with it. It's bigger than I am, and I feel like if I can just chip away a little piece of it and help support your learning in that, then that's a success, and I think it was, in that sense, successful. It's great to have you here. Just to remind us of where we were talking about Pharaoh's hardened heart last week, and particularly how Pharaoh, on many occasions, hardened his own heart. He stiffened his own heart before God then stiffened his heart. And the process, this is really fascinating, the process by which God stiffened Pharaoh's heart was one of using a stiff hand. When you have somebody that's rebellious, like a Pharaoh, rebelling against God, God swoops in with a stiff hand and applies pressure. Pharaoh relents a little bit and then comes back. And in effect, his heart is stiffening. And so that's what that process is repeating again and again and again. And then we get to the crescendo of the plagues, which were God's stiff hand applied to Egypt. And that crescendo, the last of the plagues is the death of the firstborn. The death of the firstborn. Now, surprisingly, the text of Scripture only devotes a single verse to the actual act of God striking down the firstborn of Egypt. Now, at midnight, the Lord struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. One verse. Now, he's talked about the death of the firstborn many times, but really just one verse to actually describe the event that happened. I think that says something. It is in the will and command and order of God to do that which he wishes with his creation. But he doesn't make more of this than needs to be. In a sense, this was his choice, his act, in order to do a couple of things. One, by this, God executed judgment on all of the gods of Egypt. You might remember we talked about this verse last time. This was one of the things accomplished. For on that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and animal, and on all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgments. I am Yahweh. How was it that God judged the gods of Egypt? What do you guys remember about that? What's that? The plagues, okay. What specifically links the plagues to the gods of Egypt?
Because all the plagues were related to the gods, like the frog was related to the frog god.
Yes, exactly. So you have Egyptians who are theriolatrists, that is, they are worshipers of beasts. That's a fancy word for that. and so God utilizes beasts and things like that, plagues, to kill the beasts. To send swarms against them, and so thus executes judgments against all the gods. And we saw also that there is another god in Egypt, the Pharaoh. And so through the death of the Pharaoh's firstborn, there's another kind of execution of judgment against a god of Egypt. Second, the plagues, particularly the plague of the firstborn, punished the Egyptians for their collective sin against the Hebrews. It's the case in this situation that one man led an entire nation into depravity. But that is often the case in history. If you think about who some individuals are that did such a thing in history, can you give some names? Hitler comes to mind right away. Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong. Anybody else? What's that? Kim Jong-il? That one? Okay, yeah. Yes, and so one individual responsible for, in a sense, enslaving and depressing and oppressing so many people. And yet, there is collective responsibility in Egypt. Pharaoh could not have done what Pharaoh did without an army of willing, compliant followers. And we see this particularly in the event where the Hebrew boys are drowned in the Nile, because Pharaoh calls up all his people to be involved in this process of genocide. And so in this case, a single individual set in motion a course of action with destructive, indeed devilish consequences, and yet the Egyptians themselves played a role in this system. There were potentially conscientious objectors. Does anybody remember from our story who some conscientious objectors might be among the Egyptians? The women, potentially. God granted them favor, and they gave their goods to the Israelites. Others? This was my unique interpretation. The midwives, which I took as Egyptians. And then Pharaoh's daughter, interestingly enough, who rescued the Hebrew boy, a boy she knew and recognized as a Hebrew, Moses. And though, perhaps not a fearer of God or something like that, one who in a sense was a humanitarian, if you will. Collective sin often requires a collective punishment. And I want to read you a passage so that you know that this is not unique to Egypt. This comes from the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln. Some of you may be familiar with it. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. That's quoting Scripture. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It was Lincoln's firm stance that the war had a providential purpose, the Civil War. Yes, to free the slaves, but also to clear the conscience and clear the guilt that had been incurred of hundreds of years of slavery in America. With the plagues, we see something like that going on in Egypt as well. And then third, through the final plague of plagues, God effected his own will to differentiate Israel and Egypt. Let's see here. Oh, I forgot to share with you a verse. Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, send out my son that he may serve me, but you refused to send him out. Now I will kill your firstborn son. So here's this requital. And then in Exodus 11:7, when he's talking about the firstborn, the death, the coming firstborn death, he says, but no dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, whether human or animal, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. As the Egyptians had separated the Hebrews and the Egyptians, so God makes a distinction between the Hebrews and the Egyptians for very different purposes and very different ends. Him to his good purposes. Does anybody remember why he wanted them to leave Egypt? Why he was going to pull them out? To worship him. Specifically to perform religious service, avad. Where Pharaoh had enslaved them for forced service, avad. He was going to bring them into a different kind of service. We had already seen in the plagues that there was some plagues where the Egyptians, for example, had darkness, and in the land of Goshen there was light. Right? Or the Egyptians had hail, and in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. We've already seen this distinction. But there is a verb, pala, which occurs again and again here, 4 times in the book of Exodus, which proclaims God's purposes of distinguishing the Israelites from the Egyptians. Both peoples were designed and intended to worship the one true God. But Egypt had chosen to worship its nature gods and to enslave the people of promise, who had been entrusted with bearing the message of the one true God as a blessing to all nations. There's another psalm here. This verb's only used one more time in the Old Testament. Know that the Lord has distinguished the faithful for himself. The Lord will hear when I call to him. Isn't that beautiful? David expressing that, in fact, it is this distinguishing marker, this distinction that God makes, that we know we are in his good presence and in his good will, and he intends good for us.
Is that a rare enough use of that word that's like a callback from David to the Exodus?
Potentially so. I mean, how much does it occur outside of the scriptures in Old Hebrew? I don't know. But it's used only in Exodus and then only in that psalm. So very, very possibly an intertextual reference to the Exodus event. Further, in the episode of the plagues, we see most clearly articulated 2 competing anthropologies. Does everybody know what I mean by anthropology? If you don't raise your hand. It's okay, I'm going to tell you. Does anybody want to tell us what an anthropology is? I think there's a store called Anthropology or something like that, right? It's not that. We're not talking about that. It means a theory or belief about the human, about an anthropos, a man or a human, okay? And so there are competing visions of man going on here. What is a human being? And to what end does a human being exist? For Pharaoh, there is no innate human nature. Man is defined in relation to political power. Man is an object to be ruled. Human relationships are governed by dynamics of power, and might makes right. We've seen this in Plato's Republic, in the discourse that takes place there. There's an individual that has this political philosophy, this anthropology. For those few who rise to dominance in power over other peoples, that is something more than human. That's godlike. And that's what Pharaoh himself was. These people are akin to gods. And it's for these few to rule by divine right the vast masses of humanity, whose nature it is to be ruled. You see that? Does that make sense? Okay. Let me give you a different side of the coin, and that is the coin from a different perspective of the biblical vision, and that is that Pharaoh is not entirely wrong. Now hear me carefully. He's correct on this one point. Humans are designed to be dependent creatures. Every one of us sitting in this room is designed to report to a master. But we have a good master. He is, in fact, our creator. And that is what differentiates God, the creator of all, from Pharaoh, who is an oppressor of men. We will serve something or someone. The question is whom. The biblical vision is of service to God, not to self. That's the only place where these agree, okay? The other side of the coin, the biblical version of anthropology, is all humans possess a nature. You and I have something which is human. We all possess it. It is alike, despite the differences of our skin, despite the differences of our sex, despite the differences of our size, our muscles, all of the physiognomic features, we have a human nature. All humans possess it. Made in the divine image, we're endowed with innate dignity. I have dignity, you have dignity, regardless of whether anybody else gives me dignity. It's not dependent on others. It comes from God. What we are obligated to do is recognize the human dignity in others. Liberty is man's rightful possession, and that is something we learn from the book of Exodus. The proper orientation of human life is to be free creatures. And that's one of the beautiful things about the American experiment, is it has recognized that fact and it has built a political system around that fact. And it took us a long time to get there. We're still working it out in all of its different unique permutations. But embedded in the laws of America is, in fact, a recognition that men and women should be free. The notion of inherent dignity is powerfully expressed in the opening chapter of Genesis. Man is made in God's image, and the book of Exodus compellingly sets forth in narrative form the notion of liberty as man's rightful possession, and of worship as man's rightful end. We are not simply free to be free. That oftentimes leads to license, and all sorts of sin can come out of that. We are free to worship. I'm going to stop there because that was a lot to take in. Questions? Yes?
You know, it's interesting. It seems like we're always trying to come back to this. I mean, you think about in the challenges we had in England with the divine right of kings versus the freedom of the people. And then, of course, we come to the establishment of our great nation. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men were created equal, except some are only created to be 3/5 of a human. I mean, and it's not like we get this in one foul swoop. Like Lincoln in the second inaugural saying, God is teaching us a lesson we need to learn. And it's interesting that we are a hard state, when it comes down to our respect for human beings. We fall off the wagon pretty fast.
Yes, and we are not alone. Slavery has existed since the history of the world, right? As long as humans have existed. Humans have enslaved other people. And so that just raises issues about moral progress and whether we can progress. And in fact, in some ways, it seems we are progressing, and yet we, at the same time, I want to reemphasize, have a human nature. And the biblical vision from Paul and others is that sin has corrupted that nature. Something there. Yep.
Well, I don't know whether or not this is ever or not, but were they ever specific about the age of the firstborn? Like, was it only the firstborn children and the firstborn young animals, or did the adult being firstborn die?
I don't know of any specificity in the biblical text, but I will tell you this. There's a rabbinic tradition that says Pharaoh himself was firstborn, but he only died through the waters of the Red Sea. But he did die. And so that's, for what it's worth, I don't know what that's worth, but it's interesting. So no, I don't know that there was a cap on the age, but yeah. Okay, all right. There's this this vision of man, if you think about, indeed the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God's intention was to call Israel out of Egypt to set them apart as a kingdom of priests. What do priests do? They minister on behalf of God. The Israelite nation was supposed to minister to the nations on behalf of God by being distinctive. That was to spread the knowledge of the one true God to others. This is what I call an anthropology of liberty. The natural condition of the human person is one of liberty. It's a word we're losing in this society, by the way. We sometimes talk about freedom, but the ideal of liberty is, we don't talk about that much. Only servitude to God truly liberates the human person, for then service is given to the Creator in accordance with true worship and the true nature of the human. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about Passover. Well, first of all, it's very interesting to me that by chapter 11 it talks about, hey, I'm going to take the firstborn and I'm going to kill them and I'm going to take you out of here. And then what happens is a strange kind of intervention in the text, an interjection. The text itself is moving and you expect a crescendo and you expect God to then kill the firstborn and move on. But that's not in fact what happens. He pauses and there's a chapter. And the chapter talks about the Passover. And it seems a little out of place. Not entirely, but all of a sudden now we're dealing with a ritual in the midst of what has been this epic tale of God's stiff hand upon the Egyptians. The text does not move directly into the plague. Instead, God sets forth the purpose of the Exodus as always to have granted Israel freedom. But again, that was never the entire command. Freedom alone breeds anarchy and license. It was always the ultimate purpose of the Exodus, to create a new nation as a community given to the worship of the one true God. This new people would be a people who would exercise their freedom in accordance with their true nature as human persons, in the ritual and ethical worship of the one true God. Ritual and ethical, moral and cultic, if you will, religious cult, religious practice. Thereby, this people would become a vehicle to spread ethical monotheism to the other nations. So, God will not remove the Israelites from Egypt until there is first a reaffirmation, a commitment again to Him through the Passover. He is bringing out a worshiping community. They must commit to Him. Our greatest human happiness, and so now what happens, this is interesting, in chapter 12, he starts to give some laws. Sounds a little bit out of place. The first law that the Jews had ever received, or the Israelites had ever received, was all the way back to Abraham. Anybody remember what that was? The instruction. Circumcision, right? Circumcise your boys. Okay, this is the second. Observe Passover. Okay? Our greatest human happiness is found in the order and structure that comes in legal frameworks that help ensure our liberty. I want to say that again. It's a little abstract. But our greatest human happiness is found in the order and structure that comes in legal frameworks that help ensure our liberty. This is the principle enshrined in one of our great American hymns, America the Beautiful. I'm going to see if you guys can repeat it for me here. America, America, I won't sing it to you, trust me, that wouldn't be, I'm not a bad singer, okay, but America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self, control thy liberty in law. Law and freedom are not antithetical. I think of this all the time because I help run schools. And one of the principles we have is ordered joy. Our kids find the greatest joy when they know what the expectations are and when they live up to them and they want to live up to them. That is the principles we are learning in Exodus right here. It's beautiful. The law of the Passover is designed to enshrine within the Israelite nation the celebration and commemoration of true liberty, which comes only from the Creator. This is unique because this law is unique because it's the only one given in Egypt. It represents the constitution of a new nation of people. It is the founding moment, very much like July 4th. 1776. It is the founding moment. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." So the first thing we need to know about Passover is it establishes newness. In the Israelite calendar, there are 2 new years. There is Rosh Hashanah, which is in the fall, and there is Passover, which is in the spring. They represent 2 new beginnings in a way. Passover, very much like New Year, we have the New Year, January 1st. We celebrate that on the calendar, but we also celebrate our national birth, July 4th. Okay, this is like that. They just call it a new year. So you have Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the calendar year for them, and then you have Passover, the beginning of their national being. It's in the month of Abib or Nisan. The people are to, so they're going to start a new thing in a new year, the new nation. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to his family, a lamb to a household. If the household is too small for a whole lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby. In proportion to the number of persons, you shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. Notice the lamb's going to be eaten. We already know it's going to be a sacrifice. They get it on the 10th of Nisan, and they hold the lamb for 4 days. And then they are to sacrifice. And as is part and parcel custom of the ancient sacrificial rites, and pretty much everywhere we find it, you sacrifice an animal, you eat the animal. It was a way of ancient butchery, but it also was a dedication of a gift back to the gods. In this case, the one true God of Israel. All right. So the Lord's Passover is to be a sacrifice. Your lamb shall be an unblemished yearling male. You do not sacrifice the worst or cheapest that you have to God. Otherwise, it's not really a sacrifice. What do we sacrifice to God? Our best. And so this is an unblemished male, a yearling male. It can be a sheep, it can be a goat. We tend to talk about it as Paschal lamb, the Lamb of God, for example, right? But it could be a goat as well. They're going to keep watch over it for 14 days. Now, this is interesting. There's an obligatory waiting period. What does that accomplish? Yes?
Well, I think it's kind of mean because all the little kids are going to name the poor thing.
Right. By that time, it's got the name. And how do you kill that which has the name? I had a friend who they had chickens. And he said, look, some chickens are for killing and some chickens are for pets. Because the little one had named one chicken, and that was the pet. And the other they were going to use for eggs and meat. And so they kind of mean for that reason. Any other thoughts? A waiting period. What does a lamb represent in Egypt? Wealth. Okay, yeah, I mean, if you can afford a lamb, you got a little bit of something, right? Okay, so now you have a slave community all of a sudden acquiring lambs or something like that. Okay, wealth. It's another one of those animals. What do the Egyptians do with animals? They worship them. And so in a way, there's a bit of a risk here if they're acquiring lambs and then holding them for 4 days. And so one wonders if this is in essence a part of the act of faith and faithfulness, that there's a danger. Because as they had said earlier on, I can't even remember, I think it was 8:22, if somebody wants to look that up, 8:26, Moses had already warned Pharaoh that it would be dangerous for the Israelites to sacrifice in the land of Egypt an animal that the Egyptians regarded as sacred. This was one of his arguments to say, we got to go to the wilderness. It's too dangerous to do that here. The people will riot against us. They'll kill us. So by holding this lamb for 4 days, there's a bit of a risk, and they are demonstrating their faithfulness to God. There might be other reasons as well, but that's just one that I thought of. Okay. That same night they shall eat the flesh. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted over the fire with head, legs, and inner organs, an entire animal. Boiling would have required the cutting up of the animal to put it into the pots. It is a single animal. It's a kind of a symbol for the nation itself. Unity, one thing. Do not leave any of it until morning. If any of it's left until morning, you burn it. This is how you eat it. Your loins girded, pull up your pants, tie them in knots, you're going to get ready to go. You're going somewhere, Israel. Your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. You eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover offering. Notice all of these things are related to the hastiness with which they're going to get out of there. Any observations you want to make about that? Yes.
You know, as you look at the two commands they've been given so far, circumcision and Passover, both of them mark them as distinctive people. And one thing we can't forget, which it becomes much more apparent as the culture secularizes, is that to be a Christian is to be distinctive. I mean, most of the population are not worshiping on Sunday. But those who are walk in the door and we go, blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We are here to do the freest act, to praise God. That is, according to you and the book of Exodus, there's nothing that exercises our liberty more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And just like Passover, it marks us as a very unique and distinct people.
Absolutely.
You know?
One might even say a kingdom of priests.
One
Right?
should say.
Right?
And,
Yeah.
And priests not only bring the word to other people, but
Yeah.
really, basically, priests offer praises to God. I mean, that's really, and sacrifices to God. So you lead the congregation in doing what free people do.
That's right.
You know, I mean, you're just leading the congregation in doing what we've been given the freedom to do. And we decide to exercise it as opposed to most people who decide not to exercise it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So in other words, you can either be Egyptian, you can be in Egypt, or you can be in Israel. Those are your two choices.
Yep. Yeah, I love it. It's absolutely. Absolutely. The Lord's judgment. For on that night I will pass through the land of Egypt. I'll strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and animal, and on all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgments. I am Yahweh. And the blood on the houses where you are celebrating shall be a sign for you. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you so that no one plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. When the Lord passes through to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts. And the Lord will pass over the doorway and not permit the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you down. Now I want to stop and talk about the blood, and I want you to turn and talk to your neighbor for 1.5 minutes. 2 questions that I want you to ask. Where was the blood applied? Hint, the answer is not so simple. Where was the blood applied? And the blood is a sign for you. What does the blood signify? Go ahead and take 1.5 minutes to ask those questions. What answers did you get for where the blood is applied?
One of the areas the blood was applied was on the top area where the door was.
Very good. On the top area of the door. Okay, wonderful. Any others? Any other ideas? That's the lintel. Yep. And the doorposts. Right? Okay. Great. That still doesn't tell me where it's applied. The front door. I heard garage door earlier. The eaves. Right. Right. Maybe any of those. That's not actually what I'm hitting at here. Let me read to you from a text called the Mekilta de Rabbi Yishmael. And put it on the 2 side posts and on the lintel. Are we all agreed that it goes on the side post and the lintel? Yes. Great. Fantastic. This means on the inside.
Oh, on the inside.
You interpret it to mean on the inside. But perhaps it means only on the outside. It's a question of concern. Actually, I think I got to turn this back on. Sorry. And I think I've been muted here too. Okay, there we go. We're good. So it's a question of debate. It says, however, and when I see the blood, that is the blood that would be seen by me and not by others. These are the words of Rabbi. Rabbi Jonathan says this means on the inside. You interpret it to mean on the inside, but perhaps it means only on the outside. It says, however, and the blood shall be for you for a token. That is, a sign to you, but not a sign to others. Rabbi Isaac says, still, I say it means on the outside, so that the Egyptians, seeing it, would be cut to the quick. Isn't that interesting? I had never thought about that, but I've been reading some. You know, one of the advantages of teaching a class on Exodus, you get a chance to actually read stuff like that. You go, wow, that's interesting. But the idea, if it had been on the inside as a sign for Israel, that might signify something. If it was on the outside as a sign for Egypt, that might signify something. So now let's get to the question of what you thought it signified. It's a sign. What does it signify? What's that? Life, okay? Life. The life of the flesh or the animal is in the blood, right? So life is a possibility. When you, this is one of the basic principles behind the ancient Jewish ritual or prescription of separating your meat and your cheese. This cheese is from a living animal and meat is a dead animal. Separating them.
Well, it struck me that it's a demarcation line, that there's this outside world and there's the inside world, and there's a sacrifice that separates it.
Yes. An outside and an inside. What's happening outside the house? Death. What's happening inside the house? You said it, life. You see that? This marks, in some ways, a barrier. There's a couple things. I just want to give you some ideas here. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years, placing the blood on the outside of the doorposts, which is a possibility. I mean, this debate's not resolved in this book, as far as I can tell, right? It's a possibility. Would have publicized to their Egyptian enslavers their willingness to sacrifice an Egyptian god. That takes some courage. That takes some risk, some pluck. According to Nahum Sarna, the slaughter of an animal sacred to the Egyptians was intended to undermine the fear imposed by hundreds of years of Egyptian bondage and thereby remove an important psychological barrier to liberation. The Israelites were prepared to sacrifice an animal sacred in their oppressor's eyes. Could the Israelites truly be prepared to embrace liberty? With the Passover meal, we see, second, the rejection of the Egyptian obsession with death and the affirmation of life. The draining of the blood from an animal before it's eaten is an enacting of the life-death distinction. For the life of all flesh is in the blood. When it says that the blood will be a sign for you, the Israelites, it would serve as a marker to the Israelites that they would be spared the death about to come upon Egypt outside. They were ransomed from the death outside by the blood, which is life. All right. There is another explanation. You want to hear it? This one's really fast. Mekilta de Rabbi Ishmael, Pischa 7. And when I see the blood, which is a commentary on this text over here, I see the blood of the binding of Isaac for sacrifice. For it is said in Genesis 22:14, and Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will see. Now, we oftentimes hear that translated, the Lord will provide. That we say, we'll see to it that you do this. That's a provision, right? But it's literally the Lord will see. And so they are looking at that connection and saying, when I see the blood of the Passover, I think of the blood of the binding of Isaac, because Isaac wasn't sacrificed. But he was about to be sacrificed. And in some traditions, a little bit of blood was spilled. Interestingly enough. So they see the sacrifice of Isaac. Likewise, it says in another passage, 1 Chronicles, as he was about to wreak destruction, the Lord saw and relented. What did he see? He saw the blood of the binding of Isaac for sacrifice. As it is said in Genesis 22:8, God will see for himself the lamb. God will provide, see to himself, for himself the lamb. Well, this is very interesting. Effectively, this is saying that God will see that Isaac was ready to be the lamb for sacrifice. But why make the connection between the binding of Isaac and the Passover? Why draw that connection? They're drawing a verbal connection, right? All those texts say God will see. God will see and relent. God will see and do this. God will see. What does that have to do with this? The binding with the Passover.
They were both unbound.
Okay.
Isaac was released when God interceded, or the angel of God interceded.
Yes.
And the Hebrews were unbound
Yes.
when Passover was over.
That's a lovely image. Yep, they were both unbound. Okay, anything else that you can think of?
Is it in the covenant?
Which covenant? Happily.
Reaffirming the covenant with Abraham.
Reaffirming the covenant with Abraham. What was that we were talking about earlier? Circumcision. And now Passover, connected through this verb. God will see a sacrifice and pass over the people. Isn't that beautiful? Now, we as Christians, I don't dispute that, except I think there was a better, more perfect sacrifice. I also see a connection between God's paschal lamb and another event in history, the sacrifice of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And I think the language of Revelation is beautiful here. For you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests serving our God, and they will reign on earth. We see here the confluence of two different things. One, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, Jesus. Through his blood, ransoming his people out of slavery to sin and death, in order to make of them a kingdom of priests serving our God. You see it? Isn't it beautiful? He fulfills within his person. He recapitulates within his person. That's a big fancy way of saying he lives it again. The story was there of God's deliverance and is now made even more perfect through Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, after the Passover comes the festival of unleavened bread. The festival of unleavened bread is a 7-day festival associated with Passover. 7 is significant. How many days in creation, everybody? 7. What is God doing? He is creating a new people, which is a new world, right? I mean, it's a new world. It's a new creation, creating a new worshiping people. So 7 is significant. It is a day of remembrance. They're supposed to celebrate it throughout their generations in a perpetual statute. They're supposed to eat unleavened bread. Why not eat leaven? The first reason is expressly stated in relation to the eating of the entire Passover meal in Exodus 12:11. And again in 12:3. It takes time for a leavening agent to work. How are they eating this Passover meal? In a hurry, hastily. They don't have time to use leaven. But that's one level of reading it. There is, I think, a deeper level that weds well with the Passover and the idea of life. Because leavening and the leavening process is a process of decomposition. It is a process of breaking down certain things in the bread itself to allow the bread to then expand and rise. So it is a process associated with death. And this is about life. It is a celebration of life, so you leave leaven out. I think this is interesting in light especially of Egypt itself, because Encyclopedia Britannica says this: during all periods of their history, the ancient Egyptians seem to have spent much of their time thinking of death and making provisions for their afterlife. The vast size, awe-inspiring character, and the ubiquity of their funerary monuments bear testimony to this obsession. The Torah, on the other hand, concerns itself with the preservation and flourishing of life, as does Scripture itself, the whole, Old and New Testaments. Think back to Genesis 1 and the flourishing of abundant life. And think of the laws which separate things of life and things of death. We already talked about meat and cheese, right? Jewish priests were forbidden from coming into contact with the dead because they were preoccupied with life. These Old Testament laws were actually meaningful in some deeper sense about these categories. called the bread of affliction, and it is also called the bread of freedom. It holds within itself two aspects of this event. A reminder of the affliction through which they lived in Egypt, and a reminder of the freedom and liberty which they were about to attain. So let's talk about who this new people is, and we're going to end by talking about this new people. They're a new people with a new year, Passover, the first month of Abib. They are a sizable, diverse people. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600 Eleph, whatever that means. Most translations say 600,000. It can mean 600 clans, which is smaller than 1,000, but either way, it's 600 Eleph, okay? Men on foot besides dependents. So if it means 600,000, we're talking about 2 to 3 million people here. If it's 600 Eleph, it's smaller, but it's not small, not tiny. Additionally, a mixed multitude went up with them, including livestock in great numbers, both flock and herd. You probably not thought about the Israelites leaving as a mixed multitude, people of different races going with them, wanting also to be a part of this worshiping community. And they were commanded not to abhor the Egyptians. Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. They had a common law of full participation. Okay? So they didn't have multiple laws for this person and that person. It was a common law. It says there shall be a single law for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. It's specific here to Passover. And they had to be circumcised. So in order to have full participation in the community, your males had to be circumcised. I don't know what females had to do. It was like some sort of ritual or something that had to come along or something. But if you were a foreigner, part of the mixed crowd going with them, and you wanted to participate fully in their community, you adopt that practice, and that was that thing. So when we come to the New Testament, we hear a lot about circumcision in the New Testament. Keep in mind, it was not simply a religious ritual. It has ethnic connotations. And so that actually enhances a lot of the readings when we think about the New Testament. If we start thinking about, circumcision was a way that they identified as a people, not just a kind of religious practice. All right. It is, okay. This is too long. We'll probably go on, but I want to talk quickly. I've got enough time to do this. Okay. One law shall be to him that is homeborn. There shall be a single law for the native born. Here you have the rabbis saying, I want to talk about this passage right here. What does this mean? Why in the world is this said? Has it not already been said, and he shall be as one that is born in the land? I mean, didn't it already say that the foreigner is going to be like the Israelite? Why do you need to have this other statement down here about the one law? Since it says, and when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, I might understand that the proselyte is like the born Jew only with respect to Passover. So he's saying, if I read this passage carefully, I might think that this one law is only with respect to Passover. And then the answer of the rabbis here is no. How about all the other commandments of the Torah? One law shall be to him that is homeborn and unto the stranger. This passage comes to declare the proselyte equal to the born Jew with respect to all the commandments of the Torah. Okay, so they are a community. As long as you meet the criteria to get in, you are in. Okay. They are a remembering community. They are a community that remembers. If you remember, it was all of this started because a Pharaoh forgot. He came on board and he didn't know of Joseph. And God's deliverance started with God remembering the Israelites, calling them to mind for action. And the Israelites, too, are called to act and remember this day. Look at the number of verses down here in which they are called to remember. Without historical memory, you are not a community. If you are suffering or a loved one are suffering from Alzheimer's, you know this. You have seen how they lose even their individual identity because they no longer share the stories of the past. They can't recall them. It's no different from a nation. And so they are a remembering community, which also means that they are an educating. This is an example of how they remembered. They took Joseph's bones, which was a promise. but they're also an educating community. Because if you are a community that is formed and you have historical memory, you have to enculturate your children into that historical memory, or you will lose your community. When your children ask you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say it's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because he passed over the homes of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but he spared our homes. Passover itself says this is a question of a bad child. When you look at the Haggadah, why would that be a question of a bad child? What's that?
They should know, right?
Well,
They shouldn't ask.
so they should know, okay. But they're children, so they're learning,
Yeah.
right? So it's probably, so we got to educate them. What does this child say? What does this rite mean to you, Dad? To you, not to me. Right? They say, okay, there's all sorts of different kids. This is one who says to you, he's the bad kid. Okay. Then you got this one. You shall explain to your son on that day, saying, it's because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This is the kid who doesn't actually know how to ask a question, because he doesn't ask a question. Daddy just has to tell him. Okay? Here you have another kid. What does this mean? He's the simple child. He's just like, what does this mean, Dad? I don't know. Right? And so the ritual of Passover itself makes place for the different kinds of questions that come from children. What is the meaning of the decrees, the statutes, and the ordinances that the Lord our God enjoined upon you, Father? Right? Okay? This is the bright child. Okay? But you have in here the kind of recognition of a principle at work about how you educate kids, and that is train up a child according to his way, and when he will not turn from it even in old age. I've translated this very specifically. Many of you may have heard this differently. Train up a child in the way he should go. I'm translating it quite literally, in his own way, his unique way. Each child has a unique, though a human nature, single human nature, a unique way of learning about these things and becoming part of the community. That's meaningful for me as an educator. Okay, so I want to just leave you, because we're at time here, with a question about, for further reflection, how are you supporting the education of Christian children? Passover is one of those ways, I'm convinced, that has led to the Jewish survival, despite all of the odds against them with all sorts of pogroms and Hitler and all that kind of stuff. This sacred annual ritual has kept them as a people. We have an obligation as Christians to raise up our children in the church, to train them in the way that they should go, but also in their unique way. And so I just want to leave that with you. And thank you so much. I look forward to next week. We will get them through the Red Sea. And then we'll start to see what kind of encounters they have in the wilderness, because there's some crises that happen in the wilderness. Thank you, guys.